Meron ba matatawag na etikang Pilipino? At kung mayroon, ano ang hugis nito? Naalala ko yung aming diskusyon nung kami mga bata pa, mga binata pa, tungkol sa Filipino literature in English. Ano ba ito? Ito ba ay Filipino literature in English, sa English? Or Filipino literature in Filipino? At kung sasabihin natin Pilipino, noong panahon na yon, kailangan tanungin anong wika sa Pilipinas ay tuturing nating representative ng buong Pilipinas. Ilipat natin ang diskusyon sa filosofiya. Dahil sa sandaling ito, mayroon ba nagsasabing walang filosofiyang Pilipino at hindi maaaring magkaroon ng filosofiyang Pilipino kung ipapantay ito sa tinatawag na Western philosophy. Kaya, kung minsan, ang ginagawa nila ay gumagawa ng pagbubukod o paghihiwalay sa philosophy bilang disiplina at philosophizing o ang aktibidad ng paggawa ng filosofiya. Mayroon bang filosofiya sa Tagalog o filosofiya ng mga bagay hinggil sa Tagalog na maaari nating linangin kahit na ito ay maging taglis lamang? Alin ba dito? None of the above or all of the above? Pagka napunta tayo sa filosofiya, kakaroon tayo ng problema ng bilingualism. At para sa iba, ang problema ay communication issue lamang. Kaya, madaling solusyonan ito sa pamamagitan na tinatawag na transliteration. Sa makatwid, bigkasin na lang natin na etika at moralidad ang pinag-uusapan natin. O kaya, ginagawa natin, nagkakaroon tayo ng code switching. Ito naman ay English, Tagalog, Espanyol kung minsan, at iba pa. Halimbawa, sa halip na hindi na tayo magkasundo kung ito ba ay value o halaga. Yung norma, naiintindihan ba nila ng mga Pilipino? Yung prinsipyo, naiintindihan ba ng pangkaraniwang Pilipino? When we talk about moral agency, ito ba ay ahensya o pagkilos? Anong kalayaan? Anong kasarinlan? Anong pagkukusa at iba pa? Kailangan natin na as bilinguals, we have a problem with what they call a combination of two natural languages. Kaya kung minsan, tinatamad tayong tuloy-tuloy na hanapin kung ano yung katumbas sa Pilipino. Kaya ang ginagawa natin ay we philosophize with English terms, lalong-luna sa mga tao o mga mag-aaral na ESL o English as Second Language Learners. So, parang shortcut, yung ginagawa natin ay ethics, morality, meta-ethics. At pag nag-usap tayo ng value, na mahihirapan na tayo pagdating sa paghihimay, kung ano ang moral versus non-moral, together with this value and misvalue, at pagka pinag-usapan natin ang norms and principles, paano natin sasali ng autonomy, heteronomy, theonomy? Talk about agency. Are we talking about human action, freedom, voluntariness, and so forth? Ang mga hamon sa pagsasalin pilosopiko ay marami. Noon nagsimula ako sa pamamagitan na tinatawag na dynamic equivalence. Sa halip na isali ng tahasan, ang ginagawa natin ay naghahanap tayo ng salin noong dalumat at hindi noong mga kataga. Ang problema dito na sasalunggutan ng mga lingwista ay sasabihin nila na kapag ginamit natin yung English, hindi natin napapansin na ito ay isang analytical language. Samantalang ang salitang Pilipino ay yung tinatawag na agglutinative. Sa makatwid, yung value ay hindi may sasalin lamang ng halaga, kundi pagpapahalaga. Kung pupunta naman tayo sa anthropology, meron din silang ginagawang distinction tungkol sa thin and thick description. Yung thin description, ang ibig sabihin nun, malabnaw. Halos hindi maintindihan dahil wala ibang masasabi, kundi basta iyon. Samantalang when you talk about a thick description in anthropology, merong isang konsepto na napakadami ng salin, komentaryo, aplikasyon, etc. When we go to ethics, we find out as soon as we try to philosophize that most of our concepts are thin descriptions rather than thick descriptions. And so it's important that we try to develop as much philosophizing in order to thicken the description of what we can call Filipino ethics. Another distinction that I found useful in trying to explain why we need to develop Filipino ethics is because there are certain things that are peculiar to the culture and which are conveyed in the language which simply are unintelligible to a different audience. Ito yung tinatawag na emic and the ethic distinction. Halimbawa, nasabi ko sa aking mga mag-aaral, para maunawayan niyo ito, isipin niyo yung mga cellphone ninyo. Dati, yung mga lumang camera, no? Akala ninyo, nung kinuha ninyo yung fotografiya na yon, ay tamang-tama. Pagkatapos nung ma-develop, ang lalabas, putulang ulo, lihis, etc. Okay, scientifically, we're talking here about the parallax view. And that's simple enough to understand if, for example, you take something before, in front of you, let us say a fountain pen or a ball pen, or even a comb, for example, put it in front of you, align it with a straight line somewhere on your horizon, close one eye, and then close another eye. Ask, what happened? The object shifted. But did the object really shift? No. What shifted? It shifted was your perspective. In philosophy, perspective translates into the whole discipline of epistemology and hermeneutics. In other words, philosophy is a point of view. Now, another thing that you discover in the study of the social sciences is a question that has not been resolved maybe in anthropology and particularly linguistics. And that is, are universal meanings completely and perfectly translatable in cultural specific configurations? And the response is no, and they haven't settled that. And that is the reason why my quest became a search, reflectively of course, for what linguists call semantic primitives for a Filipino meta-language for moral life and agency. In other words, there are certain terms which are at the core of philosophical thinking which are simply untranslatable because they arise out of a particular cultural matrix that is inimitable in another context. When you encounter these untranslatable terms, what that means is that not that Filipino ethics is esoteric thereby in the sense of unique or sui generis. Those terms merely indicate the need to define more precisely, yet to be defined nuances in other features of the Filipino moral ethics ethos and its ethical rationality. That perspective actually came from my background in theology, where there was an attempt to translate theological and religious terms into the culture of the people. Very succinctly, enculturation adopts two strategies. One is indigenization, and the other is contextualization. Contextualization is something that happens constantly. You listen to a sermon in any church and in any confession, and the preacher will try to apply to context what the message of Scripture is all about. My problem, and that is a philosophical problem, is the other wing of enculturation, which is indigenization. And that is the process of recovering some of the regional lexicon, which in linguistics are called the semantic primitives, for Filipino pre-colonial discourse about moral action, moral life, and the moral universe. In other words, to simplify, the path that I chose forward in order to attempt a philosophy of ethics in the Filipino is to pose the question as an academic, how may Filipino academics talk or converse intellectually in Tagalog, for example, about ethics, morality, conscience, natural law, moral value, without immediately and necessarily resorting to such foreign terms. One step is to pose the question even further than that. How did our forebears understand and discourse about the moral life before the native lexicon was recast in colonial borrowings, for example, from Spain and the United States, as etika, moralidad, conciencia, batas moral, at iba pa? In other words, what were the indigenous concepts? How were they lexicalized, if at all? To repeat, the enculturation or the indigenization process is an attempt to equip local moral discourse with the basic tools provided by the culture itself, the better ultimately to confront Filipino moral questions in their authenticity and immediacy. Kasi madaling lumusot. Pag pinag-uusapan ninyo ay Western ethics, pipiglas ka, tatakas ka, pero kung sa Tagalog na, hindi ka makaiwas. To begin, the starting point for defining ethics might start with the Western dictionaries. And there, after a while, looking at various definitions, you see how they gravitate to either of one of two directions. One that is essentially what we would call axiological, and the other deontological. Occasionally, you might find a note contrasting the normative and the virtue approaches to ethics. When we talk about ethics, we have to keep in mind that there are two tasks, and that is theory building, and the other is the guidance dimension. In other words, we create a theory which will help us guide the moral agent to adopt the appropriate decision. So substantively, ethics is that branch of philosophy which helps humans to navigate between the polarities of human choice, choices of good and bad, right and wrong, decent, obscene, private, public, happy, sorry, lucky, fatal, and so on, and to provide at the same time rational justification to guide human choice. After a while, in the ethical tradition, certain schools of thought crystallized into dominant patterns, and they embody both the theory building and the practical methods of decision making. And that is why very often you will hear, not only in ethics but also in other domains, value-based approaches, rule-based approaches, outcomes-based approaches, virtue-based approaches, process-based approaches, and the list could go on. Eventually, however, you ask, but what is at the heart of ethics? And the core of ethics is simply about moral choice. But when you reflect philosophically on moral choice, you will immediately see that it is a complex, it's a very multi-dimensional process. A sampling of the polar dichotomous or centrifugal moral keys are those that we already talked about. There is the tension between the good and the bad, the choice between right and wrong, the issue of whether something is proper or improper, or whether this issue is personal or impersonal, whether it belongs only to the individual or it belongs to the community, whether the question is a secular or religious question, whether this is about the ethics of being or the ethics of doing, whether the problem is theoretical or whether practical, or in more familiar terms, whether the solution being offered is prescriptive or optional, and so on. Ano nga ba ang etika? Ano nga ba ang etika at moralidad kung titingnan natin sa pananaw ni Pepe at Pilar? O kaya, halimbawa ni na Juan de la Cruz at Maria de la Pasión. Ang moralidad ay nakagiwang pagkilos sa araw-araw na pamumuhay. Yan ang moralidad. It's a justification at what we might call first order of rationalization. Ang etika naman ay ang mas sinop na pagsusuri at pag-aaral, that's why it is called a discipline, tungkol sa pagpapasya, and that is decision-making, sa harap ng sari-saring uri ng pagpipilian. Ayon sa decision sciences, every day we make somewhere around 30,000 decisions. And what is that all about? It's order or para o upang matukoy natin ang mga angkop na pamamaraan ng pagpapasya kapag kinakailangang mamili sa harap ng mga hamon ng buhay. But what binds all of these disparate choices together? What drives or generates the polarities of moral existence in the first place? To me, the Filipino answer seems to be this: whatever is good, right, decent, fulfilling for the human being. Sa makatwid, ang pinag-aabalahan ng etikang pillory ay ang tunay at makabuluhang pagkatao, kalikip na ang wastong pamamaraan ng pagpapakatao. Our culture confirms this extremely complex process in the proverb, madaling maging tao, mahirap magpakatao. Sa madaling sabi, ang etikang Pilipino ay agham ng papapakatao o masinop na pag-aaral kung paano magpakatao. If ethics is about the human project at core, then etikang Pilipino is all about pagpapakatao. All too often we think that the moral question has to do only with the good and the bad and the right and the wrong. Yet, at the root of the moral is the concept, the task, and the process of becoming human. At the most personal level, the questions become a bit more specific. What do I make of my life? What is my personal project? And some put it in religious terms, what is my vocation? When I am challenged sa aking pagpapakatao, paano tayo tumutugon? What action should I choose? Or, at the most universal level, at the philosophical level, so to speak, what are the good and the bad ways of human flourishing, as that is coined today? Or, what are the best practices of humanizing oneself? You might pose it in a problematic form. When was the last time you were most challenged in your sense of personal humanity? O kailan mo naramdaman huli na hindi kinilala ang iyong pagkatao? Ano naman ang mga sangkap ng etika? Upang manuwain ito, kailangan suriin natin sandali, ibig sabihin ng agham or science, which we can divide into three groups, roughly, and into the natural sciences, the social sciences, and another group that has no definitive name and sometimes is called speculative sciences or integrative sciences, and that is where ethics, philosophy, religion, and theology belong. But every science is characterized by the disciplined inquiry into a defined set of issues and concerns, which it explores critically, methodically, and systematically. The inquiry usually operates with a characteristic set of concepts, terms, and processes that we may designate as its toolkit. When you go to other sciences, you will recognize toolkits like this. Mathematics, for example, has in its basic toolkit numbers and symbols. Genetics has its 4 DNA bases. Physics has its basic theories of energy. Linguistics has its letters and phonemes. Even philosophy attempts to create a meta-language for concepts that fall into metaphysics, epistemology, cosmology, anthropology, and so on. So similarly, the philosophical study of ethics has its own set of distinctive key categories: lexica, grammar, and syntax. The immediate challenge for Etikang Pinoy is the challenge of indigenization, meaning the challenge to articulate a vernacular toolkit at par and as functional as those of other developed traditions. But here, I must issue a warning, a caveat. The Tagalog lexicalization will inevitably propose terms whose emics may not translate without remainder into, for example, Bisaya, Ilocano, Bicol, Ilonggo, Pampango, and the rest. Some methodological procedures may not even need to be replicated. Sa makatwid, ano ang toolkit ng Etikang Pinoy? Ano ang mga susing dalumat at kataga? What are these indispensable concepts for ethics in a discipline? What are the specific instruments in the toolkit? When you turn to Greek philosophy for ethics, you will find that the tools include etike, action, deon, arete. Scholastic philosophy had actus humanus, referring to human versus humanizing activity, bonum, referring to the good or value, lex naturalis, or natural law, and then you have the principles of double effect, the theme of virtue and vice, and so on. Christian philosophy included finis ultimus, because it was looking for man's ultimate end or destiny, and added sin and conversion. After a while, this gets extremely complicated. James Gustafson, a theological ethicist, proposed an approach to reduce the issues to 4 buckets of questions. One each for moral agency, moral criteria, and moral context, if you limit yourself to philosophy. And there's a 4th bucket, and that is controlling beliefs, to include those designated even by philosophy as meta-ethical, such as the ultimate grounds of ethics. So then, one of the first toolkit is moral agency. And here are the questions of what is this agency, how does it operate, and why? The question in tradition has always been, what makes any act a human act, which sounds tautological until you break it down, where you understand that actually what it means is what makes an act of choice a humanizing choice. And in fact, that is what tradition was doing. It was distinguishing actus hominis, the act of man, and actus humanus, which is a human act, referring to a conscious and a free act. But there are also virtual acts. And there are acts which remain in the mind and are never executed. There are foreseen and unforeseen consequences. You have to inquire into the motive and the intention. And those were the traditional issues of classical ethics. Today, the language has changed, and we talk more in terms of attitude and try to analyze that primarily from the scientific point of view before we bring it to the level of philosophy. And today, we recognize that attitude has cognitive, affective, and behavior elements. And each of those could be a study in itself. Globally, you can talk about conduct. distinguishing this from individual acts. And evidently, today, there is a large emphasis on the neuroscience of behavior. Faced with that, what does Pinoy ethics propose? Picking up our concepts of the EMIC, I propose that we consider the following concepts. Galaw, which, following the language usages, breaks into kislot, which are automatic reflex actions born out of the autonomous nervous system. You have kilos, which is a hybrid of something that you do and the manner by which you act. And there is gawa, and that is traditionally what we study under the scope of law. So far as voluntariness is concerned, three concepts come up, and that is kusa, kusang loob, and sadya. The number of complex activities whose moral judgment becomes controversial precisely because it's very difficult to draw the line between kusa, kusang loob, at sadya. Larger than that, you have to take a look at not only galaw, you have to take a look at loob. Bakit? Sapagkat ang loob ang pinagbubukalan ng galaw. Walang galaw na hindi nagbubuhat sa loob. Let's have to flash back to traditional and classical Western philosophy and take a look at subjectivity as the source of agency. And there you will find the questions of what is the nature of loob. You'll have to ask, what is the nature of loob? And the quick answer is, it is the subject of action. What are the elements of loob? And following the linguistic branchings of the terms available in the language, at least in Tagalog, you will find one that refers to malay, another to dama, another to ugali, another to isip, another to bait, and another to kalooban. The 6 branches ultimately trace back to the root, and that is loob. How does this operate? What are the dynamics of loob? Particularly when you pose one loob with another loob, ano nangyayari sa kanilang pag-uugnay? How is loob configured? Iisa lang bang anyo niyan? And at least in our context, 2 configurations become salient. And that is katauhan, which you can roughly translate into psychological personality, and the other, character, pagkatao. Another major concept, the second major concept in ethics is moral context. And here, we're talking about moral action as existential. Any moral decision is inevitably situated in some existential context. And it is only through context that we sort out the moral from the non-moral questions. We make all kinds of decisions, but not all of them are moral. And sometimes we are faced with certain issues we think are not moral, but are actually moral questions. That is revealed by context. Back to tradition. How did tradition discuss context? You will find that referred to ordinarily as personal circumstances. And those personal circumstances are understood as psychosocial. They're defined by locus and tempus. In other words, space and time. Contemporary culture is also preoccupied with context, but it looks at context in light of what we understand with the social sciences, and we find that in our minds we establish certain geographies of cognition, or probably that is better exemplified by the boundaries that we established between kami, tayo, at sila. These are anthropological boundaries. Move to philosophy, and you translate that into circumscriptions of katatayuan, larangan, daigdig. Again, taking a quick look, after having taken a look at the tradition, having compared its evolution in contemporary times, how does Pinoy context emics look like? When we talk about context, and we translate it into Tagalog, keeping in mind what you said originally about the analytical and the agglutinative, ang salin ng context sa Tagalog ay ang ginagalawan. It's the primary context of morality, and that refers to the interaction, to the area of activity constituted by ako at ang aking kapwa. Hindi lang ako, kundi kasama aking kapwa. When we look at Psychologiyang Filipino, they have determined that the Pinoy concept of tao cannot be fully grasped without referring to the kapwa. And in their study, they describe 8 levels of interaction, which are then classified into 2 basic sets as ibang tao at di ibang tao. That is the immediate context. But evidently, there is a larger context, and that is ang labas ng loob. And loob is revealed by way of the body, in which loob is encased, salita, because we can only know what is inside loob if it is articulated, and through the instrumentality of objects around us. This interaction, which we will describe eventually, is moralized as pagkaloob, pagkasing loob, pagkalooban, basically opening to the other, seeking the common and reciprocity. That is the context. The second bucket that we are talking, the third bucket rather that we are talking about, apart from agency and context, are criteria. And the first criterion in order to determine whether a decision is moral or not, is whether it is responsible. And when we talk about responsibility and immediately translate that, we are bound to miss 2 nuances. And the first meaning in Tagalog is not pananagutan, it is pagtugon sa pang-akit o hatak ng buti. In the tradition, that whole question was about the good and the contrast between the objective or the really and truly good, between what is perceived and accepted as good, a subjective good, leading us into the problematic options when faced with choices of good versus good, of good versus bad, and of bad versus bad. Transferred to the modern context, we now have discussions about the bonum, but as an abstract metaphysical bonum, a transcultural universal bonum, which evidently has to be brought into the concrete world, the whole problematic of the one and the many, an old philosophical concept. How is something one and at the same time many? So how is bonum one and at the same time several goods? And you will find concrete bona or goods in context: societal, economic, political, cultural, religious, etc. And having determined all of those, you ask the philosophical question, are those goods available for a catalog? Can they be ordered into some kind of hierarchy? And what happens when they run counter to each other? As indicated, the Pinoy emics is that before we talk of responsibility as pananagutan, we're talking about responsibility o pagtugon sa buti sa pamamagitan ng pagpapahalaga. I took a look at the social and scientific literature, and through a process of abstraction determined from those studies that the core sociocultural values reduced into 4. And they were love, power, honor, and security. However, note that those studies were in the main constructed and conducted and received and interpreted in English and other languages. My question, going back to indigenization, was, what were the Filipino equivalents? What were the concepts that were originally meant to be posed, which then became translated into those? And I tried at the same time to organize them into some kind of moral configuration. And the answers are that the key, the core Filipino values reduce into katahimikan, kapangyarihan, kabutihang loob, kagandahang loob, at kalinisang loob. Because they were supposed to be universals, I kept them in code in order to understand, in order to get the readers to understand that they should not be taken only in their literal, but also in their composite senses. This you can configure ethically, and one pattern would be teleological, another deontological, another pragmatic, another characteral, and so on. That is criterion one. Another criterion, and then that one that will be more familiar to many, is that the decision must not only be responsive to good and responsible to value, it must also be accountable. And accountability translates into pananagot sa bunga ng galaw na nagbubuhat sa loob. What does the tradition say about natural law? Natural law, simplistically, is the law that you discover in nature as a whole, which then can be organized in some form of ascending order. Yes, primary precepts, for example, do good and avoid evil. That is the most primary. The secondary is what is good and evil in a particular context. And you can think, for example, of the Ten Commandments as secondary principles. You shall not kill, you shall not steal, etc. And then you descend into tertiary norms where you distinguish what is manslaughter, how is that different from homicide, and how are both not murder. And you could still go further down and specify them into rules, guidelines, and so forth. Modern natural law theories are embedded and developed by certain sciences, by the sciences, although they have lost contact with the philosophical discussions and have limited themselves to determining only the laws that they can determine in their particular domain. And so you have laws, natural laws, in the sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, etc., impersonal laws, truly laws of nature. On the other hand, when you turn to social sciences as anthropology, ethnography, sociology, linguistics, economics, and political science, the laws there do not depend in the same way on nature, but rather on convention. We got used to certain things. Or contract. We agree that certain things will be handled and managed this way. And one of the outstanding forms that it has taken is positive law. On the other hand, you have finally the integrative sciences as ethics, philosophy, theology, and so on, and they focus on a different type of law, and that refers specifically to human nature. What is the law that governs man in his nature? So what are the Pinoy emics with regard to natural law? Responsibility is first, as we said, pagtugon sa buti, and second, pagsagot sa dapat. Dapat. Together, the two make up pananagutan. And when we examine the language, we will find that natural law breaks into three dimensions. Dapat, dahil. o bilang kailangan. Tumutugon sa ating mga pangangailangan. Dapat dahil makatwiran. Ayon sa katwiran nating pinag-isahan. At dapat dahil kung hindi mo susundin, iyong uutangin. Dapat bilang utang. A third criterion, and that is not developed here, is decision as mabait. When we try to explore this, we need to go back to the classical tradition of virtue, and as well to the contemporary philosophy of virtue, so that we can isolate from loob that specific element called bait, which we take for granted, but which is so important and without which virtue is inexplicable philosophically in Tagalog. I try to philosophize on bait. I explore its mnemic nuances, and I attempt a summary of sorts, after which, as we have done so far, we establish counterpoints to the classical tradition, counterpoints to the contemporary decision, and look for an appropriate word to translate for virtue, only concluding that this must remain an unfinished quest. To recap, the whole of Filipino ethics is about pagpapakatotoo sa pagkatao. And that is virtue. Basically, it is pagpapakatotoo sa bait. To summarize, Ethicam Filipino can be synthesized as follows. First, the Filipino conceptualization of ethics is structured around pagpapakatao, whose substance cannot be verified without pakikipagkapwa-tao. Second, ethical theory is inadequate if defined simply as pagpapakatao and explained, for example, by the metaphysics and epistemology of value or buti. Integral to its definition is pakikipagkapwa-tao and explained, for example, by the existentialism of interpersonal relating, and that is bait. Number 3, ethical subjecthood is defined by law, presenting as conscience, which you use for the first time, but that is actually conscience insofar as it responds by way of free activity to its iterative structuring by labas, through katawan, wika, at bagay-bagay or corporality, mundanity, and sociality, according to certain moral, meaning humanizing criteria, which we summed up as dapat, buti, at bait. 4, it is through free agency and responsible interactivity that the person reconstitutes itself subjectively by way of loob and objectively by way of labas, your reality checks. That is to say, human activity as pagpapakatao occurs in 3 ways. Wika, katawan at bagay-bagay, falls into 3 types, gawa, kilos, at gawi, and has 3 levels of voluntariness or intentionality, kusa, kusang loob, at sadya. The ethical agency o pakikipagkapwa-tao consists in personalized interactivity realized in the social context of kami, tayo, at sila, and governed by the relational principles of magkaloob, magkasing loob, and magkalooban. Number 5, the criteria of human activity are the values or the teloy of katahimikan, which structure loob as the person appropriates them in activity, and that is the agency of kapangyarihan, in conjunction with the norms of dapat, in its specific dimensions of kailangan, makatwiran, at utang. 6, because of its inherent challenges, moral fault or sala against the buti, bait, or dapat required for pagpapakatao sa pakikipagkapwa-tao is a given possibility and can take at least 3 forms: pagkukulang, pagkakamali, at pagkakasira. Finally, pagpapakatao sa pakikipagkapwa-tao is a complex project of pananaw, paninindigan, at pagpapatunay which, though arduous, is not beyond reach. Persons can acquire some of its superior qualities. Halimbawa, sukdolbuti at ubad bait, provided that they respond to its challenges with the ideal dispositions of kabutihang loob, kagandahang loob, at kalinisang loob. Consistently pursue decisions resolutely, buong-buo ang loob, so that the moral choice comes about almost naturally, where the initial sadya transmutes to kusang loob and ends up as kusa. We started with culture, we must return to culture. Indigenization is drawing forth the concepts that are latent in the culture in order to bring them back, retooled for further analysis. Ayon sa ating sariling wika, ang hindi lumilingon sa pinanggalingan, hindi makararating sa paruroonan. Maraming salamat sa inyong pakikinig.